Howdy friends, I'm Joel Empey and welcome to another episode of Joel Empey Talks Mixed Martial Arts, and on today's episode, we're going to have a bit of an unusual episode since there's no UFC event for the next couple weeks. There's a Bellator this weekend, but it's not that intriguing to me. So on today's episode, we're going to do something a little bit different, and I'm going to give you the top 5 fights that haven't been booked yet for 2020 that are must-see, must-book fights for the year 2020, in my opinion. So I'm going to give you my top 5 fights that I got to see in 2020, and these are all fights. This isn't like, I'm not going like crazy outside the box here. I'm picking fights that are actually logical and could potentially be booked and are actually likely to be booked in the year 2020. So without further ado, my number 5 pick is Yair Rodriguez versus J.E.T Magomedov. Now this is a fight, it's been booked before. Yair, got cut from the UFC for ducking J.E.T. At least that's what the narrative was. And then Yair's come back to the UFC and has looked great since he's come back. Meanwhile, he had the knockout of the year against Chan Sung Jung, a decent performance against Jeremy Stephens. Meanwhile, J.E.T. undefeated throughout his UFC run. These guys are both very tall, very long fighters for the featherweight division. This fight's just interesting on so many levels, not just because it was previously booked, so there's a bit of animosity and intrigue there already built into the fight. Also that both fighters are very young, 28 and 27 respectively. J.E.T.'s 28, Yair's 27. And these guys are largely considered to be, the next crop of contenders. Like, they're in the same class as Max Holloway, as these guys that are in their 20s that are also just physical specimens in terms of their frames at featherweight. All of these guys, just like an Ortega or a Moicano. Volkanovski doesn't have the same kind of frame, but he's also, in this new class. So that's like these guys are the new class. And there's nobody ranked ahead of J.E.T and Yair other than Volkanovski. And him and Holloway are fighting next month. So J.E.T and Yair need to fight. It needs to be a 5-round fight because we haven't seen J.E.T through 5 rounds yet. That is a must before J.E.T gets a title shot. So we need to see this fight. We need to see it for 5 rounds. So it's got to be a main event. It can easily be a main event on any ESPN card, really, particularly if you were in Russia or, if they're back in Mexico for Yair. So the winner of this fight needs to contend for the featherweight belt in 2020, and this fight needs to happen. This is the fight that, for clarity in the division, for just closing out the chapter. These guys, they're already scheduled to fight one another. We need to bookend this chapter. We need to, get a conclusion here, get some finality to the situation, and see which one of these two young guns is the better featherweight fighter. My number 4 must-see fight for 2020 is Diaz versus McGregor 3. Now, I know it looks like McGregor's returning to the octagon January 18th. That's the rumor right now. I'm not sure if I believe that. That's less than 2 months away. I think that if he was going to fight on January 18th, the opponent would have had to have been announced by now. That's beside the point. I mean, Conor does take fights on shorter notice. If you look at the Floyd fight or the Khabib fight, even the Eddie fight came together very quickly. So it is possible that Conor fights on January 18th, and it's rumored that it looks like Cowboy is going to be Conor's opponent. And I would love to see that fight. I would love to see Conor return in any capacity, which is why this fight is, to be honest, only at my number 4 must-see fight for 2020. Because, to be honest, I would be down to watch Conor compete against anybody. I would also be down to watch Nate compete against anybody. But I don't think anybody makes sense for Nate except for Conor. Like, Nate needs these big challenges, these big money fights, these intrigue fights. There's, Jorge was at such a special place. There's no one else like that can actually, be an A-side or, a second A-side in a fight with Diaz. And Diaz needs that big name. He's not just out here to fight anybody. He needs to fight a guy with name recognition that people are going to be intrigued to see. And that's what Conor is. These guys have already fought twice. It's 1-1. The rubber match is an inevitability, at least it seems like. And that's the way that they've spun it. But let's say Conor does get the Cowboy fight. If he goes out there and loses to Cowboy, I think that and he could lose to Cowboy. That's a very real possibility. If he goes out there and loses to Cowboy or anybody, I think Conor might be done. And I just don't think any other fight makes any sense for Nate Diaz. So I think Nate Diaz's next fight really has to be Conor. And I think that for Conor, his next fight should be Nate, because if he goes out there and fights Cowboy and loses, I think he might be done. And then we'll never get the Diaz trilogy. These guys are both in my top 5 favorite fighters of all time. I could watch them fight a million times. It's going to be action and entertainment every single time. And that's why it's my number 4 must-see fight in 2020. Now, before we get to the top 3, I'm just going to go through all of my honorable mentions. Number 1 honorable mention, Colby versus Jorge. The only reason why this isn't in there is because Colby obviously has to fight Usman next month, and that is going to be a challenge for him. I'm not sure who wins that fight. Both fighters are exceptional, have exceptional cardio, exceptional wrestling. I don't know who I favor in the Colby and Usman fight, but if Colby wins, Colby versus Masvidal is top 3 biggest fights in 2020 without a doubt. Without a doubt. Maybe, borderline number 1 or number 2 for sure. But just because we don't know the outcome of the Colby and Usman fight, I don't want to put this fight in my list. And as far as Masvidal goes, the only fight that Masvidal could be in that would make the list for me, and Masvidal's in a special place right now, very interesting. But I don't really care to see Masvidal versus Usman. I don't really care to see Masvidal versus any of the real contenders at 170, to be honest with you. The only fight at 170 that I really want to see for Masvidal at this point is the Colby fight. It's a grudge match, clash of styles, clash of personalities. That would be an epic fight. Now, more honorable mentions. I'm going to list a bunch of fights that are all in the women's strawweight division. Just a bunch of different matchups of just basically 4 different fighters. So I would love to see Joanna versus Tatiana. I would love to see Andrade versus Tatiana. Joanna versus Weili Zhang. And Rose versus Weili Zhang. Or Zhang Weili. Why those matchups? See, Joanna versus Tatiana. Tatiana, if you don't know who she is, she's basically like a female 115-pound Khabib. She mauls people with her grappling. Now, the issue with Tatiana, she would have had the last title shot if she was healthy. She has a bad neck injury, and so it's murky as to her future and when she's going to be able to compete again. But Joanna versus Tatiana would just be sensational because Joanna's takedown defense is next level. Plus, her movement is so crisp. Her striking, her counter striking, her ability to stick and move, and then fight off the takedowns. I think she might be able to give Tatiana a run for her money. And then the other girl I think might be able to give Tatiana a run for her money is Jessica Andrade. Because Andrade is just a tree stump of a human being. She has absurd physical strength and then a low center of gravity at only 5'1". That low center of gravity and her absurd physical strength, it's possible, I think, that she would be able to stuff the takedowns of Tatiana and then be able to potentially use that immense power that she has in her hands to knock Tatiana out or at least, win the fight, by decision. So those 2 girls are the 2 girls that I think could take on Tatiana. So I really want to see one of those 2 matchups in 2020. I think the Andrade and Tatiana matchup makes a ton of sense. And then Joanna versus Zhang Weili. That's the next title fight likely at the strawweight division. So we're likely going to get to see that matchup. And I'm really excited for that. I think Joanna matches up really well with Zhang Weili. Joanna with her movement, once again, takedown defense, crisp striking, length. She's got a lot of assets at 115 pounds, and I think that she just matches up very well with Zhang Weili. And the more interesting fight for Zhang Weili stylistically, in my opinion, just from a fan's perspective, in a vacuum, I would prefer to see Zhang Weili versus Rose, Thug Rose Namajunas. Now, that fight doesn't make sense because Rose is coming off a loss, hasn't fought in a while. Joanna is the next contender for Zhang Weili. But I would love to see Rose. I think that the way that Rose's style matches up with Zhang Weili's would be a lot more interesting. I don't think Rose can stick and move quite as effectively as Joanna, so I think she could get herded into the fence, get pressed on the fence. Zhang Zhang Weili could use her wrestling there. Then maybe Rose can use one of her slick submissions, or maybe she could stick and move. I think that would just be an incredibly intriguing fight, and I don't know who would win that one. So those are the women's strawweight fights that I'm dying to see in 2020. I hope we see at least some permutations of those fights. My last honorable mention fight is Cejudo versus Joseph Benavidez, Joey B, the Joa Constrictor. They've already fought before. This is a fight that needs to be ran back. It needed to be ran back. It was a close decision. Shouldn't have. It was a close decision the first time that these guys fought. And Cejudo, I want to see him fight again. And this is the next fight that makes sense to me. I think that you let bantamweight kind of sort itself out. There's a lot of good contenders at bantamweight. And then you go down to flyweight, you defend your belt, and then you can go back up to bantamweight if you're Henry, take on one of those new contenders, and let flyweight kind of work itself out again to spit out another contender. Because Joseph Benavidez is clearly the number one contender. I don't think there's a clear number one contender at bantamweight. And for me, for my money, this might be controversial. I think Cejudo's the number one pound-for-pound fighter on the planet. So if I didn't at least honorably mention Cejudo, the number one pound-for-pound fighter on the planet on my list, then what kind of an honorable mentions or list would this be? My number 3 must-watch fight in 2020 is Israel Adesanya taking on Paulo Costa. It's so unfortunate that, because this fight was supposed to be early 2020, first quarter of 2020 for sure, but it looks like Paulo Costa has injured his bicep. He's going to be out till mid-2020 type of thing. So this fight is going to be at least delayed, and Izzy's probably going to have to take on another person. Izzy wants to fight somebody in early 2020, so we're running a risk here of losing this fight if Israel Adesanya does lose. Now, if Izzy goes out there and fights a Romero or a Cannonier in early 2020 and looks impressive against them, then this Costa fight's even bigger and even more intriguing. So there's a risk that Izzy gets hurt and or loses, and we don't get this Costa fight. But there's also a reward potential if Izzy has another incredible performance like he did against Whitaker here recently. Then this Costa fight could be bigger than ever. Now this fight, the reason why it's so intriguing is it's a rare, super rare occurrence of an undefeated champion fighting an undefeated challenger. That almost never happens in modern UFC. Off the top of my head, 3 examples of that happening in modern UFC, and I'm pretty sure these are the only 3 examples because I did some research about this a little while ago. Holly Holm versus Ronda Rousey, Luke Rockhold and Chris Weidman, and Rashad Evans versus Lyoto Machida. Those are the only 3 occurrences in modern UFC history where we had undefeated challengers taking on undefeated champions. I could be wrong about that. Let me know if there's another example. I went through championship fights, and those are the only 3 that I saw. So just to have that, and these guys are both strikers, knockout artists. They're gonna swing, and there's a real dichotomy of how they both like to strike. Izzy likes to be so smooth and calculated and really technical, and Costa's just arrogant, and he's a Terminator. And I say arrogant, I mean that as a compliment. He just presses forward totally arrogantly. And you could hit him with the kitchen sink, and he'll just get... And then he'll keep marching forward, just like the Terminator. And that breaks people mentally and breaks his opponents physically as well. And so I worry about Costa's... I worry about that style if you don't get the knockout in the first 10 minutes. It's almost like Conor McGregor. It's 8 minutes of hell. But when you're pressing forward with no regard for your own health, safety, cardiovascular systems, you're just trying to press your opponent to break their will and break them mentally, break them physically, then I question how long you can last. We saw Costa fade against the Romero. So that's going to be the intriguing thing when Izzy and Costa fight. Hopefully this fight doesn't get ruined. Hopefully we get to see it in 2020. My number 2 must-see fight in 2020 is another rubber match, another trilogy, Stipe versus DC 3. Now, so these guys have fought twice. DC knocked Stipe out the first time in the first round, and then Stipe TKO DC in the 4th round this most recent time. Now, when they fought, DC, the second time that is, DC was winning the majority of that fight, but in the fourth round, Stipe found a body punch on DC. DC just had no answer for it. It was really kind of perplexing. Stipe just repeatedly just dug the body shot, dug the body shot, dug the body shot. And it was like DC just had no defense for it. All he could do is eat them, and you could just see him wilting on every punch. Eventually, he got TKO'd, and it looked like that might be DC's last fight ever. But DC has come out and has said he wants to fight one more time. It's got to be Stipe. It's got to be for the belt. He's got to have that one back. And the UFC's willing to do it, which, if you know anything about how the UFC runs their business and operates, they don't generally give fighters that kind of an opportunity. Like, if you're going to retire, they're not going to give you a title shot right before you retire. It just shows how much respect the UFC has for DC, that they're even willing to afford him this opportunity. And I respect DC just as much as the UFC, if not more. DC is one of my all-time favorite fighters. I just love the guy so much. If I was going to be a professional MMA fighter, I would want Daniel Cormier to be my mentor. Cormier just has such a great story. He's had such a hard life. He's been through so many hardships. He's come up just short so many times. If he could win this fight and then ride off into the sunset as the UFC champion, in my mind, this fight between Stipe and DC, this third fight, is to determine who is the greatest UFC heavyweight of all time, and maybe heavyweight MMA GOAT. I'm super intrigued to see the complexion of a third fight. Will DC use his wrestling more offensively? Will Stipe find that body shot again? How is this third fight going to look? Is it going to look like the first one? Is it going to look like the second one? Is it going to look completely different? That's the intrigue. I think it will look completely different. And if DC can pull this off once again, it would just be the perfect storybook ending on what has been a really difficult professional career for DC, competitively, athletically. And my number one must-see fight in 2020 is the same as everybody else's. It's a fight that every hardcore MMA fan, it's been on every hardcore MMA fan's list as a must-see fight for the next year, for the last 4 or 5 years. And I'm not exaggerating. It's Khabib Nurmagomedov versus Tony Ferguson. These guys have been parallel in the UFC, just dominating the competition in tandem. And their paths were supposed to cross 4 different times, and the fight has been canceled every time. I believe the first time it was booked was in December 2015, 4 years ago. And people were wanting to see the fight even before then. Both guys are on 12-fight win streaks in the UFC. Khabib's 28-0, undefeated in his career. And Tony Ferguson has always been the guy that everybody thought could give Khabib the best fight possible. And yet we still just haven't gotten to see it, and we just see Khabib dominate everybody else who doesn't have a really good grappling background. Khabib hasn't fought anybody at his highest level in the UFC. Khabib has not fought one person with a high-level grappling pedigree. Tony Ferguson has that. Tony Ferguson doesn't rest when he's on his back. He's slicing you open with elbows off of his back. He's always scrambling. He has the most legendary cardio in the entire UFC, second to none. So he will just nonstop work. When Khabib does get his takedown, that's what Khabib does. He gets takedowns. When he does get his takedown, Tony is going to rain elbows from the bottom. He is going to scramble and make Khabib work at every single second. And then when they're on the feet, he is going to press Khabib. He is going to look to exhaust him. He's going to look to slice him with elbows. He is going to style on him. He's going to be confident. He's going to be loose. He's going to have fun in there. There's nobody that, it's just so frustrating that we haven't seen this fight yet. We should know how this fight turns out. And, Tony's only getting older. I worry that Tony might even be a little bit past his prime now. Like 2 or 3 years ago would have been a perfect time for this fight to happen. We haven't gotten to see it yet, but it's not ruined yet. Both guys are still on their win streaks, but we cannot risk another fight for either of these guys. We have to put them together. We have to see the matchup. Khabib versus Tony Ferguson, the number one must-watch fight in 2020. Probably, I hate to hyperbolize it, but probably the fight that I've been wanting to see and have been the most intrigued to see in all of UFC history. And that's because we've been teased about it for 4 years, and these guys have just been on the most ridiculous, dominant winning streaks for years and years and years, parallel to one another in the same division, in the same organization, but we haven't gotten to see them fight yet. We have to see this in 2020. All right, so that does it for this episode of Joel Empey Talks Mixed Martial Arts. I hope you enjoyed this episode. I hope you enjoyed the conversation. What are your top 5 fights, or any fights that you really want to see in 2020? Who do you think would win in any of the 5 fights that I brought up in this episode? Comment below in the YouTube comments. I really appreciate and read all of those, and will reply for sure. Now, like the video if you did enjoy it. Please subscribe to my channel. Go ahead and follow me on Twitter at Empey Talks. And until next time, cheers, friends.